The pie was apple. It was always apple. Abigail Mercer had learned that early on, not because Ethan Walker had ever said so, but because the one time she'd brought Blueberry, back in the third week of that first autumn, he'd eaten the whole thing without complaint and without comment, which was somehow worse than if he'd refused it outright. A man like that wouldn't tell you what he wanted. He'd just endure what you gave him and be grateful in a way that made you feel vaguely terrible about yourself. So she'd switched back to apple the following Tuesday, and the look on his face when she set it on his porch railing, not a smile exactly, more like something releasing in his jaw, had told her everything she needed to know. That had been 2 years ago. She was still bringing apple pie every Tuesday. The walk across the property line took about 12 minutes if she went straight through the gap in the fence that they'd never formally agreed upon, but that both of them had started using as though it had always been there. The grass was different on his side. Thicker, less managed, with patches where the cattle had grazed too hard and left the earth pale and scuffed. She knew the rhythm of his land by now, the way you know a song you've heard too many times. The soft depression near the creek bend where the ground stayed wet into June. The cluster of cottonwood trees that marked the northern edge of his pasture. The slight rise before the barn where the wind always came in sideways and made her eyes water. She didn't mind the walk. That was the honest truth, though she wouldn't have said so to anyone in Millhaven. The town had opinions about the walk. The town had opinions about most things Abigail did, which was part of why she'd stopped volunteering them. She'd learned in her first year of running the Mercer Ranch alone, after her father's stroke had taken him to her aunt's place in Denver and left the land to her at 24, that people in small towns didn't require information to form conclusions. They'd do it without you, faster sometimes if you gave them less to work with. What the town had concluded about Abigail Mercer and her Tuesday walks to the Walker property was somewhere between charitable concern and pointed disapproval, depending on who you asked. Ruth Bellamy at the dry goods store thought it was sweet but misguided. The Harmon brothers, who ran cattle on the east side of town, thought it was a waste of a young woman's time. Reverend Cole's wife, Margaret, had said to Abigail's face, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that it was generous of her to look after a man with no family nearby, as though Ethan Walker were a charity case rather than a functioning rancher who'd been working this land since before Abigail was born. None of them knew what happened during those Tuesday visits. That was by design. The morning she was thinking about now, the one that had started everything unraveling, had been in late October, when the aspens along the ridgeline had gone gold, and the air carried that particular Colorado sharpness that felt like a warning. She'd come over the rise near the cottonwoods and found Ethan on the roof of the smaller outbuilding, replacing shingles in the methodical, unhurried way he did most things. He hadn't heard her coming. She'd stood at the base of the ladder for a moment, watching him work, and something about the angle of the light and the steadiness of his hands had made her chest feel strange in a way she'd pushed down quickly and filed away as tiredness. "You're going to fall off that roof one of these days," she'd called up to him. He'd looked down without startling. He almost never startled. "Not today. That's what you said last spring when you were fixing the barn eaves. And I didn't fall then either." He'd driven another nail home with 2 clean strikes and set the hammer down on the shingles beside him. "Pie day." "Pie day," she confirmed, lifting the cloth-wrapped dish she was carrying. He'd come down the ladder with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood his own limitations, not slowly out of weakness, but measured, like he was doing a calculation with each rung. She'd learned not to offer her hand at the bottom. He didn't want it, and offering it made something flicker across his face that she didn't want to cause. They'd sat on the porch steps the way they usually did, the pie between them on the boards, and she'd cut 2 pieces with the small knife she always brought because he didn't have one thin enough and he'd never replaced it. The conversation had been ordinary at first, her fence along the south pasture that needed restringing before winter, his concerns about the condition of the creek after the dry summer, the price of hay being driven up by a drought 2 counties over. And then she'd made a joke. She couldn't even fully remember how it had started, something about the younger ranchers in the valley making the same mistakes her father had made 30 years prior, and she'd said something like, "At least you were around to know better," and he'd said, with that flat dryness that she'd come to understand was his version of humor, that being around long enough to know better mostly just meant you'd had more years to make the same mistakes. "You're not that old," she'd said without thinking. He'd looked at her then. Not the quick glance he usually offered, but actually looked at her, and the quality of it had been different from his usual attention. More searching, like he was trying to determine whether she'd meant it the way it sounded. "Abigail," he'd said, and her name in his voice was strange because he almost never used it. He used it the way he used everything, sparingly, so that when he did, it meant something. "I'm 30 years your senior." "I can do arithmetic," she'd said, more tartly than she'd intended. Then, because the silence afterward felt dangerous, "I meant you have good judgment, that's all." He hadn't responded to that. He'd looked back out at the pasture and eaten his pie, and she'd done the same, and the conversation had moved on. But something in the air between them had shifted and hadn't shifted back. She'd felt it on the walk home, a low-grade unease, like a sound you can't identify but can't stop listening for. That had been 3 weeks ago. She was still listening for it. This particular Tuesday morning, Abigail rose before the sky had finished deciding what color it was going to be. That was her usual hour. Her father had kept early mornings, and she'd inherited the habit along with the land and the debt and the particular exhaustion of trying to be adequate to both. She dressed in the dark without lighting the lamp, pulling on her work trousers and the heavy flannel shirt that had belonged to her father and that she'd kept because it was warm, and she wasn't sentimental but also because it was warm. She fed the horses first, then checked the water in the east trough, which had been freezing over in the nights now, and needed breaking each morning with the iron bar she kept leaning against the fence post for that purpose. Then she walked the south pasture fence line with the mental inventory she ran every few days. Loose wire here, a post leaning there. Nothing urgent, but nothing she could ignore past spring. By the time she came back to the house, the sky had settled on a gray so pale it was almost white, and the mountains to the west had that crisp early winter look that made them seem closer than they were. She washed her hands at the pump and went inside to make the pie. She'd made it enough times now that she didn't need to think about it. Her hands did what they did. Flour and butter worked together until the dough came right. The apples peeled and cut and tossed with sugar and cinnamon and a small amount of nutmeg she'd started adding maybe 6 months ago on impulse and had never mentioned. She wondered sometimes if he noticed. She suspected he did because Ethan Walker noticed most things and said relatively little about any of them, which was its own kind of attention. While the pie baked, she ate her own breakfast standing at the counter, eggs and bread and black coffee, and looked out the kitchen window at the fence line that separated her property from his. You could see the corner of his barn roof from here if the weather was clear, the roof he'd been working on that day in October. She was still looking at it when she heard the sound of a horse on the road. Lucas Bennett rode like he owned the road, which was appropriate because his family had, in several significant ways, helped build it. The Bennett land grant dated back to his grandfather's era, and the family had leveraged that early foothold into something substantial: timber contracts, a share in the local bank, property holdings across 3 counties. Lucas himself had spent 4 years in Denver studying commerce, and had come back 2 summers ago with new ideas about irrigation and cattle marketing and a very particular interest in Abigail Mercer's ranch. He was 28 years old, with dark hair that stayed neat even after a ride, and the kind of easy confidence that came from never having been told no by anything he actually wanted. He was not a cruel man. That was important to acknowledge because it would have been simpler if he were. He was generous in the right moments, attentive in public, and genuinely persuaded that what he wanted for Abigail was what was best for her. That particular combination of qualities, the sincerity layered over the assumption, was harder to argue with than simple selfishness. He tied his horse at her post and knocked at the door rather than coming around to the kitchen, which was his version of formality. "Lucas." She opened the door holding the dish towel she'd been using to check the pie crust. "You're out early." "Had business in town." He glanced past her at the kitchen, the way he always did, taking an inventory she'd never given him permission to take. "Smells like you're baking." "I am. Going to the Walker place again?" He said it carefully. Not an accusation exactly, but not a neutral question either. "Tuesday," she said, as though that explained itself. Because it did. Lucas came in without being formally invited, which was also his way. He sat down at her kitchen table in the chair nearest the window and accepted the coffee she poured him without acknowledging that she'd had to pour it. He had a folder of papers with him that he set on the table with a practiced casualness that told her immediately this wasn't a social call. "I wanted to talk to you about the South Pasture lease," he said. She sat down across from him, keeping the dish towel in her hands because it gave her something to do with them. I thought we settled the south pasture last month. We talked about it. We didn't settle it. He opened the folder and turned it toward her. Survey maps, what looked like a contract draft. My father's willing to offer more favorable terms, a 3-year arrangement which gives you predictability, and the rate we discussed would help you through the spring if the cattle market stays soft. She looked at the papers without touching them. The south pasture was the most productive grazing land on her property. Leasing it to the Bennetts would solve the immediate cash flow problem that had been grinding at her since summer. She knew that. He knew that she knew that. I'm still thinking about it, she said. Abigail. He said her name differently than Ethan did, with a kind of patient authority, like he was reading a line he'd rehearsed. The offer is solid. There isn't a rancher in this valley who wouldn't take these terms. Then it should be easy to find one who will. His expression shifted, not anger, but something that wanted to become annoyance and was being held back by the discipline of a man who understood that annoyance wouldn't serve him here. He had good instincts, Lucas did. That was part of what made him difficult. I'm trying to help you, he said. I know. She did know. That was the complicated part. I need more time to look at the numbers. He nodded slowly, folded the papers back into the folder, and let the subject drop with the efficiency of a man who knew when to retreat and when to circle back. Then he shifted into the social register of the visit, asked after her cattle, mentioned that the Harmon brothers had been having trouble with a stretch of fence along the creek road, talked briefly about a dance at the Grange Hall the following weekend. She answered where answers were needed and kept most of her attention on the pie. When it came out of the oven, he watched her wrap it. You go every week, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. The man has a daughter in Fort Collins. He's not without people. His daughter visits twice a year, and I'm not going because he needs looking after. She tied the cloth around the dish with a knot she'd tied so many times her fingers moved without instruction. I'm going because I want to. Lucas looked at her for a moment with something in his face that might have been genuine puzzlement. The look of a man confronted with a preference he couldn't categorize into a scheme he recognized. He's old enough to be your father, Abigail. And yet he's not my father. He's my neighbor. She picked up the pie. Thank you for stopping by, Lucas. I'll send word about the lease. He left. She heard his horse on the road for a while after the door closed, and then the morning went quiet again, and she stood in her kitchen holding the pie and feeling the exact shape of the choice she was not yet admitting she was making. Ethan Walker had been awake since 4. This was not unusual. Sleep had become a negotiation in recent years. He could get it, but not without conceding significant portions of the night to wakefulness, to the kind of stillness that was just consciousness without purpose. He'd read somewhere years ago that men his age slept lighter. He hadn't believed it then because he'd been younger then, and you didn't believe things about age until age had made them true. He lay in the dark for a time, listening to the cattle sounds from outside. The occasional low of movement, the particular creak of the barn in the pre-dawn when the temperature dropped another few degrees. Then he got up, dressed, and went to work, because that was the only other option, and it was a better one. By the time the sky started to lighten, he had already fed the animals, broken the ice in the water trough, and walked the north fence line where 2 posts had been giving him concern since the last freeze. One of them was worse than he'd thought. Rotted at the base, not salvageable. He made a mental note to pull it out and replace it before the next hard frost, and knew, with the weary accuracy of a man who had been maintaining this property alone for 6 years, that the mental note would expand into a half-day job that would push something else back. Clara had handled the books. He could feed cattle and fix fence and judge weather and handle horses, and 100 other things that the land demanded, but the administrative portion of running a ranch, the ledger work, the correspondence with buyers, the tax filings, had always been her domain, and after she'd died, he'd managed it badly and known he was managing it badly and found he didn't care enough to improve. He cared about the land he could do. The financial situation wasn't a crisis. That was the most he could say for it. He ate breakfast at the kitchen table, the same breakfast he made most mornings, eggs and potatoes, nothing refined about it, and sat with his coffee for longer than he needed to, looking at the window that faced west toward the Mercer property. You couldn't see the house from here, just the top of the rise and the fence line and the particular way the grass flattened in that direction when the wind was coming down from the mountains. He thought about what she'd said 3 weeks ago. He'd been thinking about it, in the background ever since. You're not that old. She'd meant it as a small thing. He knew that. She'd been making a point about judgment and experience, and the comment had been almost an aside, the kind of thing you say without fully registering. But he'd registered it. He'd registered the way she'd said it, not with the particular careful warmth that people used when they were trying to be kind about something uncomfortable, but with a kind of impatience, as if the 30 years between them were a tiresome arithmetic and she'd grown bored of doing it. He'd turned 48 and then 50 and then 56, and along the way he had grown used to the way people spoke around age when they were trying to be decent about it. He knew what careful warmth sounded like. What she'd said hadn't sounded like that, which was probably nothing, which was almost certainly nothing. Ethan pushed his chair back from the table and rinsed his plate at the sink. He had a fence post to replace. But she came over the rise at 10:30, the same time she usually arrived, the cloth-wrapped pie in the crook of her arm and her coat buttoned to the collar against the cold. He saw her from the north pasture where he'd been working on the fence post, and took a moment before she'd spotted him to watch her cross the field in that particular way she had. Purposeful, not hurrying, like she'd decided on the direction and the pace and the rest of it would sort itself out. She was a capable woman. He'd known that from the beginning, when she'd first shown up at his door 18 months before her father's stroke. She'd been 23 then, helping run the ranch alongside her father, and she'd come over to ask about his experience with a water rights issue that bore on both their properties. She'd known what she was asking about. She'd taken notes in a small book she'd brought with her, and the questions she had asked were precise in a way that told him she'd done preparatory work. He'd respected her then. He respected her now. The fact that he'd also, somewhere in the intervening time, grown to look forward to Tuesdays in a way that sat differently from the other days of the week was something he was disinclined to examine too closely. "You're in the north pasture," she called when she'd spotted him and altered her course. "Fence post," he called back. She came through the gate, not the main one, but the gap, which she'd started using so naturally that he'd stopped thinking about the fact that it had originally been a gap from a section of old fence he hadn't yet replaced and had now become, in practice, a door. She looked at the post he'd been working on, which he'd gotten partially dug out. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough." He pulled off his gloves and tucked them into his coat pocket. "Bottom 2 feet. Rot." She crouched down and looked at the base of the post where it met the earth, which he'd expected. She had the same instinct he did to see a problem firsthand rather than take someone else's word for it. "Cedar next time," she said. "My father swore by cedar for the wet sections." "Your father was right about most things," Ethan said, and meant it. She looked up at him from her crouched position, and for a half-second something passed across her expression that he couldn't name. Not quite amusement, not quite the thing he'd been trying not to think about since October, before she stood and held up the pie. "Apple." "I figured. You want coffee first or after?" "After. I want to get this post in before the light shifts." She set the pie on the flat-topped fence post at the corner and rolled up her sleeves. "Then let's get the post in." He looked at her. "You don't need to—" "Ethan." She said his name the way she said most things, without ceremony, but with a firmness that closed off the sentence he'd been going to finish. "Hand me the other side of the bar." So they dug the post together, which was how it usually went when she arrived to find him mid-task. She never announced this as assistance. She simply became part of the work. He'd learned not to waste time protesting it. She was stronger than she looked, not large, but wiry and accustomed to physical effort, with good instincts about how to apply force efficiently. They worked in the silence they'd developed over many months, the kind that didn't require filling. When the new post was set and the dirt tamped firm around it, he tested the stability with both hands and found it solid. She was pulling her sleeves back down, looking at the line of fence they'd extended. "You need to do the whole north line before spring," she said. "I know. 3 more weak posts at least. I can see them from here." "I said I know." She looked at him sideways. "All right." A pause. "Are you going to the Grange dance next weekend?" The shift in subject was so abrupt he needed a moment to follow it. "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm 56, and those dances are for the Harmon brothers, and whoever they're currently courting." "That's a ridiculous reason. It's a practical one." He picked up the digger and the spare post he hadn't needed and started back toward the barn. She fell into step beside him, which she usually did. "Lucas Bennett came by this morning," she said. He kept walking. "The lease." "Yes." A pause. "You heard about that?" "Small town." She was quiet for a moment. "He also mentioned you. Not directly. He just said you had a daughter in Fort Collins, as a way of saying you weren't alone, and therefore I didn't need to—" She stopped. "Didn't need to what?" "Keep coming over." Ethan set the post against the barn wall and turned to look at her. She met his eyes without backing away from it, which she always did. She had that quality of not flinching from direct attention, which was rarer than most people realized. "Do you want to stop coming over?" he said. "No," she said. One word. He held it somewhere and didn't look at it too directly. "Then don't," he said, and went inside the barn to hang up the digger. Coffee was at the kitchen table because the porch had gotten too cold in the last 2 weeks. She'd already figured out where the cups were and had water heating on the stove by the time he came in from washing his hands. This also was usual, that she moved through his kitchen with a comfort that should have seemed strange, but didn't, because she'd made it gradual enough that he'd never marked the exact moment it became natural. He cut 2 pieces of pie and set them on plates while she poured the coffee, and they sat down across from each other, and the conversation continued in the way it usually did, catching up on the week's small inventory of tasks and decisions and observations, the texture of neighboring lives that had grown gradually overlapping. She told him about a heifer she'd had trouble with, a difficult birth she'd managed alone at 2 a.m. 4 days ago. She described it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had done it before and would do it again and didn't need acknowledgement for the difficulty, just the recounting of events. He listened and asked 1 or 2 questions that showed he understood what she'd managed, and she accepted this without making anything of it. He told her about his daughter Hannah's letter, which had arrived on Friday. Hannah was 31, with a husband and 2 small children, and their correspondence was regular but careful, warm on her side, appreciative on his, with a distance maintained by shared unspoken agreement about how much to expect from each other. Hannah had mentioned possibly visiting in the spring. He said this without emphasis. "That would be good," Abigail said. "Probably." He drank his coffee. "She'll have opinions about the state of the property. Because it needs work? Because it always needs work, and she'll remember what it was when her mother was here." He said this without particular feeling, or at least without feeling he intended to display. Clara was better at the visible things. The house, the yard. "I've let some of that go." Abigail looked around the kitchen with the careful eye she sometimes turned on things when she was making an assessment rather than a judgment. He'd learned to distinguish between the two. "The kitchen's fine," she said. "The curtains could be washed." "I know." "The porch railing on the south end has 3 boards that should be replaced before your daughter puts any weight on them. I'll add it to the list." "The list is getting long, Ethan." "The list has been long for 6 years." He said it without bitterness, just the plain weight of it. "I'm one person." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I know." And she said, "I know the way people said it when they weren't just acknowledging the words, but actually sitting inside the fact of what you'd said." He looked at her across the table, and something in his chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing regularity. A kind of compression, like the feeling before weather changed. He looked away before she could read it. "The pie's good," he said. "Nutmeg," she said. "I know, you started it about 6 months ago." She blinked at him. He picked up his fork and kept eating. "I thought you wouldn't notice," she said. "I notice things." "You never said." "Why would I have said?" She seemed to think about this, and then she made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, suppressed before it became one. "I don't know," she said. "I suppose you don't have to." She left a little before noon when the light was starting to think about afternoon and the cold was sharpening again. He walked her to the gap in the fence, because he always did, and they stood on their respective sides of it for a moment in the way they usually did. The moment before she turned to go that had lengthened incrementally over months until it had become a kind of beat in the rhythm of these visits. "You should come to the dance," she said. "I told you, I'm not going. You told me a bad reason." "It's my reason." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "Abigail." "What?" He looked at her across the gap. The gap that had been a gap in a fence and was now a door that both of them used, that both of them had wordlessly agreed to. She was looking at him with that particular direct attention that she brought to things she was taking seriously, and he knew he was about to say something that he should not say, or that said itself before he'd completed the decision to say it. "Is Lucas Bennett what you want?" he said. The question hung in the cold air. A crow called from the cottonwoods to the north. She didn't move. "That's a strange thing to ask," she said carefully. "You can tell me it's none of my business." "It's not none of your business?" She paused. The careful quality of her voice had shifted, not guarded exactly, but deliberate, the way she spoke when she was trying to be accurate. "No," she said. "He's not what I want." "What do you want?" She looked at him for a long moment. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. A horse moved somewhere in the south pasture behind her. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still figuring it out." He nodded. He looked at the fence post they'd replaced together, and then at the long line of his north pasture, and then back at her. "Good pie," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I know." She turned and started back across the field, and he stood at the gap and watched her go until she crested the rise and disappeared over the other side. He stood there for another minute after she was gone, his hands still in his pockets, listening to the crow in the cottonwoods. 30 years. That was the arithmetic she'd called tiresome. He wasn't sure, yet, whether tiresome meant she'd stopped believing it mattered, or whether it meant she'd simply stopped counting. He went back to work. He had a list that needed attending to, and a fence line with 3 more weak posts that wouldn't fix themselves, and a kitchen with curtains that needed washing before spring. He went back to work because that was what he knew how to do, and because motion was better than stillness when your thoughts were doing the thing they were currently doing. But he noticed, walking back across the north pasture, that the day looked different than it had that morning. He couldn't have said exactly what had changed, only that something had. The Grange dance was on a Saturday, and Abigail did not go. This was a decision she made and unmade 3 times over the course of the week, finally arriving at no on Friday evening when she was standing in front of the small mirror in her bedroom, holding a dress she rarely wore, and feeling profoundly foolish about the fact that she was holding it. She hung it back into the wardrobe and went to bed early and told herself it was because she had cattle to check at dawn, and a fence audit to finish along the south line, and approximately 14 other reasons that had nothing to do with not wanting to spend 3 hours watching Lucas Bennett navigate the room toward her with that patient, inevitable confidence of his. She slept badly. This was becoming a habit. Saturday she worked until her back ached in the specific way that meant she'd been bending over fence wire too long, and then she came inside and made supper and ate it standing at the counter because sitting down felt too much like stopping. Through the kitchen window, the lights of Millhaven were just barely visible in the valley below. The Grange Hall would be lit up by now, fiddle music, the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and whatever someone's wife had baked for the occasion. She'd been to those dances before. She knew what they were. She was also fairly certain that if she went, Lucas would take it as a signal, and she wasn't ready to deal with what came after a signal she hadn't meant to send. The problem with Lucas Bennett was not that she disliked him. The problem was almost the opposite. He was reasonable and capable, and the version of her future he was proposing was not unreasonable, say. She could see it, when she tried, laid out in practical terms, the lease arrangement evolving into something more formal, the 2 properties eventually combining in ways that made economic sense, a life built on compatibility and shared interest, and the particular stability that came from 2 people who understood the valley and the work and the rhythms of this kind of existence. She could see it. And every time she saw it clearly, something in her chest went quiet and flat, like a fire that wasn't getting enough air. She washed her supper dish and went to bed, and did not think about Ethan Walker's kitchen or the way he'd said, "I noticed things about the nutmeg." She thought about it anyway. The following Tuesday was different from the start. She came over the rise and found not Ethan, but his horse, a 16-year-old bay gelding named Cotter, whom Ethan had acquired as a 4-year-old and cared for with the same undemonstrative constancy he applied to most things, tied at the north pasture gate, which meant Ethan was somewhere on foot. She looked around and found him halfway down the east side of the pasture, crouched near the creek bank, doing something she couldn't identify from the distance. She took the pie to the porch and left it and came back and went through the gap and down toward the creek. He heard her coming before she was close enough to speak, which was usual. His hearing was better than hers, which she found faintly irritating given the age difference he seemed to think counted against him. He looked up without surprise. "Watch the bank?" he said. "It's soft from the freeze-thaw." She stopped at the firm ground 3 feet from the edge and looked at what he was doing. He'd found a section where the bank had collapsed, taking about 4 feet of pasture with it. The raw earth was pale against the dead winter grass, and the creek below was running dark and quick with the recent snowmelt. "When did this happen?" she said. "Sometime in the last week. Didn't notice it until this morning." He stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. "I need to regrade this section and put in some willow stakes before the next high water, or I'll lose another 10 feet. She looked at the collapsed section, calculating. "You need help." "I can manage it." "You said the same thing about the fence post, and I ended up with dirt on my sleeves." He looked at her with that particular expression he had. Not quite a frown, not quite the opposite, somewhere in between that she'd privately started to think of as his default setting. "You don't have to keep Ethan." She said his name the same way she always said it when he was about to say something she was going to refuse. He closed his mouth. "I'll come Thursday morning. We can do the staking together. I have willow along my South Creek section that needs thinning anyway." A pause. He looked at the damaged bank, and then at her, and then back at the bank, doing the internal negotiation she'd gotten familiar with, the one where he weighed his self-sufficiency against the practical reality that things actually got done faster with two people, and he was not, despite his best efforts, immune to that particular arithmetic. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she confirmed, and went back up the bank the way she'd come. Chum. What she hadn't considered was that agreeing to Thursday meant she would be in town on Wednesday for supplies and would run directly into Ruth Bellamy at the dry goods counter, and that Ruth Bellamy had apparently attended the Grange dance and had thoughts about both Abigail's absence and certain conversations that had taken place there. Ruth was 63, with sharp eyes behind her spectacles and a genuine warmth that she deployed in ways that were not always gentle. She'd known Abigail since childhood and had known Abigail's father longer, and she occupied that particular position in small-town life where people told her things because she seemed trustworthy, and she repeated things because she believed that information, properly managed, was a form of community service. "You missed a good evening," Ruth said, measuring out the flour Abigail had ordered while conducting a simultaneous evaluation of Abigail's face. "Lucas Bennett asked after you specifically." "I had an early morning." "You always have an early morning. That's not a reason. That's a condition." Ruth tied off the flour sack. "He's a good man, Abigail. His father was difficult. Everyone knows that. But Lucas is different. He's put real work into understanding this valley." "I know he has." Abigail set the sack in her basket and moved along the counter to the dried beans. "A pound of the dark red ones." "Margaret Cole thinks you'd be foolish to keep him waiting." Ruth said this with the particular care of someone delivering information they've been asked to pass along while maintaining plausible deniability. Her words, not mine. Margaret Cole has opinions about most things. She does, but that doesn't make this one wrong. Ruth scooped the beans with a practiced hand. "What is it you're waiting for exactly? If you don't mind me asking." Abigail minded. She minded in the specific way you minded something that you couldn't easily explain without having the explanation become the town's business by nightfall. "I'm not waiting," she said. "I'm being careful." "Careful about Lucas? Careful in general?" Ruth looked at her over the spectacles. It was a particular look, the one that meant she was deciding whether to say the thing she was actually thinking or the thing that passed for diplomacy. She apparently decided on the thing she was thinking. "People are talking about your Tuesdays," she said, keeping her voice down but not as far down as she might have. Abigail kept her hands busy with the basket. "People can do what they like. Ethan Walker is a good man. No one is saying otherwise. But a man that age, alone on his property, there's a kind of loneliness that can make people form attachments that aren't—" Ruth stopped and started again. "You're 26. The choices you make in the next few years will shape everything after. I just want you to be thinking clearly." "I'm thinking clearly," Abigail said. She said it without heat because she'd learned that heat was what people in Millhaven used to tell themselves. Their advice had landed on something real. "What else do I need?" She finished her list and paid and left, and walking back to where she'd tied her horse, she had the distinct sensation of the town rearranging itself around a story she hadn't agreed to be part of. Ethan didn't go to town often in winter. The roads were bad and the errands were few, and he'd built up sufficient supplies in autumn to last through the cold months, with only occasional trips for specific items. But the Thursday before Abigail was coming, he needed a new draw pin for the gate hardware that had cracked, and the hardware store was the only place in the valley that stocked them. He tied Cotter outside Halverson's Hardware and went in, and found himself in the unfortunate position of being the second customer of the morning after Deputy Aldridge, who was a large, affable man with very little control over what his face did when he was working something over in his mind. Ethan. The deputy's expression did something complicated. You look... How are you? Fine, Ethan said, moving past him toward the fastener section. Haven't seen you at the dances lately. Haven't been going. Right. Aldridge followed him with the unconscious persistence of a man who wanted to say something and hadn't figured out how yet. Saw Abigail Mercer in town yesterday, as a matter of fact. Ethan found the draw pins and examined the sizes. She mentioned she was coming by your place Thursday, helping with the creek bank, she said. He selected the right size and turned toward the counter. That's right. Aldridge scratched the back of his neck. Listen, Ethan, I don't want to get into your business. Then don't. But people are going to talk. They already are, some of them. And Lucas Bennett is a patient man until he isn't, and his family has a long reach in this valley. I'm just saying. He spread his hands in the gesture of someone disclaiming responsibility for the information they were delivering. For what it's worth. Ethan set the draw pin on the counter and looked at the deputy for a long moment. He'd known James Aldridge for 20 years. He wasn't a bad man. He was, in the way of most people in Millhaven, someone who experienced other people's lives as a problem to be managed toward acceptable outcomes. James, he said, what exactly are you saying? Aldridge blinked. Just that you should be... that it might look... I'm going to stop you there. Ethan put money on the counter and picked up his purchase. The only thing I'm doing Thursday is repairing a creek bank with my neighbor's assistance, because she offered and I accepted. If the town wants to put something else on top of that, I can't stop them. But I'm not going to conduct my life based on what looks like what to who. He nodded to the deputy. Good morning. He left. He was halfway home before the low-grade heat in his chest settled back to something manageable. The thing was, and he rode home with this thought sitting heavy and unwelcome in his gut. Aldridge wasn't wrong that people were talking. He'd heard enough in that brief exchange to understand the shape of what was circulating. And the town's conclusion, if he read it correctly, was that he was a lonely old widower and Abigail was a soft-hearted young woman who hadn't yet understood that kindness could be misread. That framing had a particular cruelty to it that he was fairly certain was unintentional, which made it worse rather than better. He thought about what she'd said at the fence gap. No, he's not what I want. And then, I don't know yet. I'm still figuring it out. He thought about that and tried not to assign it too much weight, and mostly failed. Thursday was gray and cold but without wind, which was the best winter working weather you could ask for in this part of Colorado. She arrived at 7:30 with a sledgehammer she'd brought from her own barn and a bundle of willow stakes she'd cut from her South Creek section the day before, which she'd stripped and sharpened with a hatchet. Each one pointed at the base for driving, the length right for the bank depth he was dealing with. He looked at the stakes when she set them down. He looked at her. She was pulling on her work gloves. You cut those yesterday, he said. I told you I would. That's a half-hour's work at least. 40 minutes. She said. The wood was green, so it went easier. She picked up the sledgehammer and tested the weight of it in both hands. Are we doing this or are we talking about it? They did it. The work was harder than the fence post had been, moving the collapsed soil back, cutting into the bank to create a proper face, then driving the willow stakes in a line that would catch silt and rebuild the bank edge over the coming year. He did the heavy digging, and she drove stakes because she had a good eye for spacing and because the sledgehammer suited her. She had efficient form, no wasted motion, and she didn't complain when the ground got difficult. They worked until almost 11 and covered most of the damaged section. His shoulders were burning by the end. He didn't mention this. The far end needs another 4 stakes, she said, looking down the line. I can finish that tomorrow. She looked at him. Your shoulder. My shoulder is fine. Your shoulder has been bothering you since October. I can tell because you favor it on the left side when you're lifting. He looked at her. You've been watching how I lift things? She met this without blinking. I watch things, she said deliberately, which was exactly what he'd said to her about the nutmeg, and he understood that she'd been holding it and had returned it at the precise moment it would land correctly. He almost said something. He stopped. They went inside for coffee without discussing it, which had become so established a pattern that he didn't question it anymore. He put the pot on while she washed her hands at the sink, and there was an ordinary quality to it. The shared kitchen, her knowing where the soap was, him knowing she took her coffee without sugar, that he couldn't look at directly or it became something larger than he knew what to do with. They sat down. Ruth Bellamy talked to you, he said. She looked up. On Wednesday. How did you know? Because James Aldridge talked to me on Wednesday. Same source. She wrapped both hands around her cup. What did he say? That people were talking, that Lucas Bennett is a patient man until he isn't, the general shape of the community concern. He said it evenly. What did she say to you? That I should be thinking clearly, that my Tuesdays were being noticed. She paused. That you might be forming an attachment that isn't... She stopped and chose a word. Appropriate. The word sat in the kitchen between them. Ethan looked at his coffee. Is that what you think? She said. He looked up at her. About which part? Any of it. He was quiet long enough that she didn't look away from him. He respected that. Most people looked away when he went quiet. She just waited. I think, he said carefully, that the town is doing what the town does, which is take two facts and build a story between them that makes the most comfortable kind of sense. He set down his cup. I don't know what's happening. I'm not sure I'm the right person to be the one to name it. Why not? Because I'm 56 and you're 26, and if I'm the one who names it, I'm the one who... He stopped, started again. There are things a man in my position doesn't get to say first. She looked at him with the steady attention she brought to problems she was trying to actually understand, not just manage. That seems like a way of not saying anything. It is, he agreed. It's intentional. Why? Because I'm not going to be the reason you make a choice you might regret in 10 years. He said it plainly, without self-pity, because that was the only way he could say it without it becoming something else. You're 26. You have the whole of this valley in front of you. Lucas Bennett or someone like him is a reasonable future. You keep saying that because it's true. It's true, and it's not the same as what I want. Her voice was level, but something in it had sharpened. I'm getting a little tired of people explaining my future to me. Ruth does it. Lucas does it. And now you're doing it, which is... She pressed her mouth together for a moment. At least the other two have a stake in the outcome. He felt the accuracy of that and said nothing. What do you want? She said. He looked at her across the table. Outside the window, the gray sky had gone a shade lighter, thin winter sun trying to find its way through. The kitchen was warm. He could hear the faint sound of his horses in the barn. That's a question I'm not going to answer at this table, he said. Why? Because the answer would be... He stopped. He was not a man who lost the end of his own sentences. He found it an unwelcome experience. Because some things need to be said in the right place, not sitting over coffee when you've got your coat on and need to get back to your own work. She looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she was reading in his face, he let her read it. All right, she said finally. Not satisfied exactly, but something closer to patient. She picked up her cup and finished her coffee and set it down. The south end of that fence line, she said. You need to get out there before the ground freezes any harder. I know. I can lend you my post driver if yours is still giving trouble. Mine is fine. Ethan. It needs a new bolt. I have the bolt. She nodded. She stood and put on her coat, and he walked with her to the door, and then outside, and they stood on the porch in the thin gray light in the way they'd stood at the fence gap. That particular pause neither of them had named or agreed to, but both of them maintained. Lucas is going to ask you again about the lease, he said. I know. What are you going to tell him? She looked out at the mountains, which were white now above the tree line and very clear against the pale sky. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm going to make sure I'm deciding it because of the land, not because of anything else. He understood that. Good. She stepped off the porch. Then she stopped and turned back. And the look on her face was the look she had when she'd decided to say something she'd been working up to. "For what it's worth," she said. "What Ruth told me. About you forming an attachment." A pause. She had the direction wrong. She turned and crossed the yard and went through the gap in the fence, and Ethan stood on his porch and watched her go. And the thing in his chest did what it had been doing with increasing frequency. That compression, that held breath quality. And this time he didn't push it away. He stood there in the cold air for a while. A long while. Then he went inside and washed the coffee cups and stood at the kitchen window looking at the fence line and the rise beyond it and the gray Colorado sky above all of it. She had the direction wrong. He turned that over in his mind, looked at it from multiple angles, set it carefully aside and then picked it back up, the way you handled something that might be fragile or might be the sturdiest thing you'd held in years, and you didn't yet know which. He went to the barn to see about that bolt. He had work to do. But the day, once again, was different than it had been that morning. The following Tuesday she came and he wasn't there. Not absent from the property. His horses were in the paddock, and smoke was coming from the chimney, but absent from the usual rhythms of the morning, which she noticed the way you noticed when a sound you'd grown accustomed to stopped. She knocked at the kitchen door and waited and knocked again. And finally she heard movement inside, slow and deliberate, and the door opened and Ethan stood there in a shirt he'd clearly pulled on recently, his jaw tight in the particular way that meant he was managing something physical. "You're sick," she said. "I'm fine." She looked at him. He looked like a man who had decided he was fine and was prepared to defend this position against all available evidence. "Can I come in?" He stepped back. She came inside and set the pie on the counter and looked at him in the better light of the kitchen. His color was wrong, not feverish, more the pale, compressed look of someone dealing with pain that had been going on long enough to become its own kind of exhaustion. "The shoulder," she said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Sit down," she said. "Abigail?" "Ethan, sit." He sat, which told her more than the color of his face had. He wouldn't have sat if the pain were manageable in the way he usually managed things. She pulled her coat off and hung it on the peg by the door. His peg, the one he used, because there was a second one that had accumulated a collection of items over the months and was no longer really a coat peg, and went to the stove to put the kettle on and then came to look at him properly. "How long?" she said. "Since Monday." "What happened?" "Lifted wrong." He said it with the flat economy of a man who resented having to report his own failures. "Moving fence sections in the south pasture. I knew better and did it anyway." "What does it feel like?" "Like I lifted wrong." She looked at him with the specific patience she had developed for these exchanges. The ones where he was going to give her the minimum of information and she was going to have to extract the rest. "Is it the rotator cuff, the same one that was bothering you in October?" A pause. "Probably." "Have you done anything for it?" "I've been resting it." "By which you mean you've been working at 70% instead of 100 and calling that resting." She went to the cabinet where she knew he kept the medicinal supplies. She'd found them once when she'd been looking for a dish towel and had noted their location with the same instinct that made her note fence conditions and water levels, and found the liniment that was there, old but still good. "Take your shirt off." He looked at her. "I'm going to rub this into the joint," she said, holding up the tin. "You can't reach the back of the shoulder yourself, and that's where the damage usually sits. So take your shirt off or spend the rest of the winter with a useless arm. Your choice." The expression on his face went through several stages before settling on something that was not quite resignation, but was in the same territory. He unbuttoned his shirt with his good arm doing most of the work and set it on the back of the chair. She had seen men with their shirts off before. This was ranch country, and summer was hot, and nobody was precious about it. But there was a quality to standing behind Ethan Walker with her hands working the liniment into the muscle and tendon of his shoulder that was not like those other occasions, and she was precise enough with herself to know it. His back was the back of a man who had worked outdoors for 30 years. The particular density of it, the old scar along the left shoulder blade she'd never asked about, the way he held still under her hands with a concentrated stillness that she understood was the opposite of ease. She worked carefully, finding the knot of inflammation with her fingers and working around it rather than directly into it, the way her father had taught her on the horses when she was 12. "You should have said something on Thursday," she said. "It wasn't this bad on Thursday." "And you were going to say something once it got bad enough?" He didn't answer. "That's what I thought." She kept working. The muscle under her hands was rigid in a way that meant several days of compensation, the surrounding tissue tightening to protect the damaged area. She'd seen it often enough to understand the geography of it. "You need to see the doctor in Harlan if this doesn't improve in a week." "I don't need a doctor." "You need someone to look at it who has more than a tin of old liniment and an opinion. The opinion is more useful." But there was something underneath the flatness of it that might have been the very distant cousin of a joke, and she pressed her thumb gently along the back edge of the joint and felt him draw a careful breath. "There," she said. "That's the worst of it." "I noticed. I'll try not to make it worse getting at it." She worked quietly for a few minutes. The kettle began to sound. Outside, the gray morning was moving toward something that might become weak sunlight by afternoon. A horse made a sound in the paddock. "The lease," he said. "What about it?" "Did you give Bennett an answer?" She paused her hands for a moment and then resumed. "Yesterday," she said, "I told him I'd take the 3-year arrangement, but that I wanted independent legal review of the terms before I signed." "He agreed to that?" "He agreed to that," she said. "He was not thrilled about it." "He wouldn't be." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That was smart." "I know it was smart. I thought of it myself." She said it without sharpness, just the plain statement of fact. "He's been assuming this whole time that I don't fully understand what I'm agreeing to. Getting the attorney from Harlan involved changes that. He'll know I know the terms." "Is the attorney the one on 2nd Street, Mallory?" "His son. The father retired." She smoothed the liniment over the shoulder cap and stepped back. "You can put your shirt back on." He reached for it without turning around, and she moved to the stove to attend to the kettle because that was the useful thing to do, and also because it gave him his back, which he probably needed. She heard the quiet sounds of him dressing and poured the water for the coffee and found the cups by the same instinct she found everything in his kitchen now. When she turned around, he was buttoning his shirt with the careful one-handed economy of a man working around an injury, and she watched this for a moment with a feeling she couldn't quite classify. Not tenderness exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated. The particular ache of watching someone you respected manage something difficult without asking for help. She put the cups on the table and sat down. "It helps," he said, settling into his chair with the practiced care of someone who had learned the positions that didn't worsen things. "The shoulder. Thank you. You'd have done the same." "I'm not sure I would have," he said. "I would have assumed it was too much to ask." She looked at him across the table. "That's the difference between us," she said. He considered that. "What is?" "You think things are too much to ask for. I think if you don't ask, you don't get. And then you've made the decision for both people." He looked at his coffee. "That's a reasonable philosophy." "It's a practical one." She cut 2 slices of pie and slid his plate across. "Eat something. You probably haven't eaten properly in 2 days." He started to deny this and apparently thought better of it. The first real snow came the following week, covering the valley in the particular quiet that only snow produced. A muffling of distance and sound that made the world feel smaller and closer and somehow more accountable. The mountains disappeared into the white-gray sky, and the fence lines became tracings in the snow, and the cattle stood in the paddocks with the patient stoicism of animals that understood this was simply one of the things that happened. Abigail spent 2 days essentially confined to her own property, managing the necessary tasks, feeding, watering, checking for any vulnerable animals. In the steady snow, and then in the aftermath, when the sky cleared and the cold that followed the storm was more serious than anything they'd had yet that winter. She didn't go to Ethan's on Tuesday because the going would have been harder than it was worth, and she'd sent word with the Harmon brothers' ranch hand, who had passed her property on his way into town, that she'd come when the road between cleared. She'd expected this arrangement to feel more manageable than it did. She kept busy because that was her default mode, and being busy had served her well since she'd taken over the ranch and probably before that. But there were moments in the quiet of the snow-covered evenings when she sat by the kitchen stove with the account book she should have been reviewing and instead found herself in a specific variety of stillness that she recognized reluctantly as missing. Not missing in the way she'd missed her father when he'd gone to Denver. That was a clean, defined ache. This was more diffuse, the missing of a presence that had become part of her week's texture. She reviewed the account books. She went to bed at a reasonable hour. She did not think about broad shoulders and old liniment and a man who believed things were too much to ask for. She thought about all of it, just not in any way she was willing to act on until the road was clear. On Thursday of that week, Lucas Bennett rode out with 2 of his hired men to check on the road conditions, which was an act of genuine civic usefulness that she acknowledged when he stopped at her gate. He was on a good horse, always was, and had brought extra provisions that he offered neighbors along the route, which was the kind of gesture he made naturally and that she had no grounds to criticize. "How are you managing?" he said from the saddle, looking over her property with the evaluating eye she'd come to recognize. "Fine. The animals are well. The roof held. Your wood stack looked low last I saw it. I cut more in November. It's sufficient." He nodded. "Walker's place. Do you know how he came through it?" Something about the way he said it, not unkind but with a particular quality of information gathering, made her careful about her answer. "I haven't been able to check yet. The road's been too rough." Lucas stroked his horse's neck in the absent way of someone whose attention was elsewhere. "You know, Abigail, I'm not a man who makes a lot of speeches, but I've been thinking that we've been circling around a conversation for a while now, and the circling isn't serving either of us." She said nothing, which was her version of acknowledgement. "I'm asking you to consider something serious," he said. "Not the lease, though the lease is part of it, but something larger. You know what I mean." "Lucas, I'm not asking for an answer today." He said it with the patience he'd mentioned to Aldridge, the patience that had a clock underneath it. "I'm asking you to consider it, actually consider it, not from the outside of it, but from inside. What your life looks like in 5 years with the serious version of what I'm describing." She looked at him on his good horse in the clear winter light and felt the genuine weight of what he was offering, Tuts. Not just the money and the family name and the practical stability, but the fact of him, a capable and decent man who had decided she was worth the sustained effort of this long approach. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He touched the brim of his hat and rode on down the road. She stood at her gate until the sound of hooves faded, and then she went back to her animals. She did think about it. All afternoon, in the way she thought about things she wanted to resolve, methodically, from different angles, trying to be honest with herself about the difference between what she felt and what she feared, and what she actually wanted. Lucas was not wrong that they'd been circling. He wasn't wrong that the circling wasn't serving either of them. The honest answer was that she was circling because she was waiting for something to become clear. And the frustrating thing, the thing she could not entirely admit even to herself yet, was that the thing she was waiting for had almost nothing to do with Lucas Bennett. The road to Ethan's property cleared enough to pass on Saturday. She didn't wait until Tuesday. She went in the afternoon, without pie, which was the first time she'd come without it since the first visit 18 months ago. She came because she'd been unable to confirm he'd come through the storm, and she wasn't willing to talk herself out of checking on the grounds that checking might mean something she wasn't ready to name. She found him in the barn. His shoulder was better. She could tell by the way he was moving, still careful, but with more range than the previous Tuesday. He was repairing a piece of harness with the slow, focused attention he brought to detailed work, and he looked up when she came through the barn door, and his face did something that was very brief and very specific, a shift in the quality of his attention, the particular change that happened when something expected arrived sooner than anticipated. "You didn't wait for Tuesday," he said. "I wanted to know you'd come through the storm all right." "I came through it all right." He set the harness down on the workbench. "You?" "Fine. The roof held. The animals are well." She looked around the barn with the habitual assessment she made of his property. "Anything damaged?" "Lost a section of the east fence. Post snapped under the snow load. I got out there yesterday to temporarily fix it." "With your shoulder?" "With my shoulder," he said, without apology. "It's better. Your liniment helped." She looked at him for a moment. The barn was dim and warm. The animals generated their own heat, and he'd built the structure well against the wind. And in the particular quality of the winter afternoon light through the boards, something about his face was very clear to her. The steadiness of it. the lines that were the record of weather and work and years, and that she had stopped reading as age a long time ago and had started reading instead as the document of a specific and particular person. Lucas came out during the snow, she said. Ethan's hands stilled on the harness. I heard. He asked me to consider something. A pause. I know what he asked. How? Because it's what he's been building toward for a year. He picked up the harness again and examined the stitching without doing anything to it. What did you tell him? That I'd think about it. She crossed the barn and leaned against the post across from his workbench, which put her 5 feet from him. He's not wrong that we've been circling. No, Ethan said. He's not wrong. He's also not who I'm circling around. The sentence left her mouth, and she felt the full weight of it settle into the barn air. Ethan set the harness down properly this time, with a finality that meant he wasn't going to pick it back up. He looked at her. Abigail, he said, I know what you're going to say. You probably do. You're going to say the 30 years again, or the town, or that you're not going to be the reason I make a choice I might regret. All of those things are true. They're also not mine to have decided for me. She kept her voice even because she wasn't angry. Not at him, not exactly. More at the shape of the conversation they kept almost having and never quite arriving at. I'm 26, Ethan, not 16. I've been running a ranch alone for 2 years. I've read 2 lease contracts. I've made decisions about cattle and credit and property law, and I've managed more difficult things than a conversation I know I want to have. He looked at her with the full-bore attention he usually held back from direct deployment, the one that, when he actually pointed it at you, was a different thing than his ordinary watchfulness. What conversation is that? He said quietly. The one where you stop managing me out of choices and tell me what you said you'd tell me in the right place. She held his gaze. You said some things need to be said in the right place, not over coffee. We're not over coffee. The barn was very quiet. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Outside, the snow creaked under some small contraction of cold. Ethan Walker looked at Abigail Mercer across 5 feet of barn floor, and she watched him work through something. Not doubt exactly, more the careful, deliberate motion of a man who had been holding something for a long time and was making the final decision about whether to put it down. I think about you every day, he said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without performance, with the weight of someone who had been thinking it long enough that saying it was more relief than risk. I think about Tuesday before Tuesday comes. I notice when you haven't been here. He stopped, started again. I'm 56 years old and I have a damaged shoulder and a fence line that needs replacing and a financial situation that's adequate at best. I don't have what Bennett has to offer. I know what you have, she said. I'm not sure you do. Then let me tell you. She pushed off the post and took the 2 steps that brought her closer to him, and she said it the way she would have said anything she'd thought through and decided to commit to. You have been more consistently decent to me than any person in this valley. Not in the obvious ways, not with money or position or the right things at the right occasions. In the ways that count when no one's watching. The way you asked questions instead of giving advice when my father left. The way you told me that post was rotted instead of letting me find out the hard way. The way you ate the blueberry pie without complaint and let me work out on my own that you preferred apple. She saw something shift in his face. I have been watching you for 2 years. I know what I see. He was very still. Now, she said, you said you weren't going to be the one to name it first. You said there are things a man in your position doesn't get to say first. She looked at him steadily. I just named it. It's named. So what do you say? The silence lasted long enough that she heard her own heartbeat, which she found annoying. Then Ethan Walker stepped forward and closed the distance she'd left between them, which wasn't much, and lifted his good hand and set it against the side of her face with the carefulness of a man who understood the weight of a gesture, and kissed her. It was not a long kiss. It was not complicated. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been thinking about the same thing from different sides of the same fence for long enough that there was no uncertainty left in it. Only the plain, serious fact of it, and the barn around them, and the snow outside, and the particular quality of his hand against her face, the roughness of it, the certainty. When he stepped back, his expression was the one she'd never seen on him before. Unguarded in a way that he usually wasn't, the careful management of himself temporarily set aside. I have thought about you every day since September, he said. Possibly before that, and I was lying to myself. She looked at him. September. The afternoon you came to tell me about your water rights application, and you'd done the research yourself instead of asking Bennett's lawyer for help. He said it with the specificity of a man who had noted the exact date of something and carried it. You knew more about the statute than I did. She felt the warmth of that, the precise quality of what he'd noticed and when, the fact that it was that. And she said, You could have said something in September. I'm 56. You keep saying that like it's an argument. It feels like one. It doesn't feel like one to me. She reached up and put her hand over his where it had dropped to her shoulder and held it there. It feels like arithmetic. And I told you in October I was tired of the arithmetic. He looked at her hand on his. Something moved across his face that she thought might be the most undefended thing she'd ever seen on him. A kind of wondering, the look of a man confronting the reality of something he'd told himself wasn't possible. The town is going to have a significant amount to say about this, he said. The town has been having a significant amount to say about it for 3 months, and we hadn't even done anything yet. That's a fair point. What does it matter? She said it genuinely, not as dismissal. She wanted to understand what it cost him, not talk him out of whatever it cost. What does it actually matter? The Harmon brothers' opinions, Margaret Cole's opinions. What does it change? He thought about this. He was a man who thought before he answered, and she had stopped finding this frustrating a long time ago. It doesn't change what's real, he said, but it will make certain things harder. Things worth having are usually harder. That's a very young thing to say. That's a very condescending thing to say. He looked at her, and then something happened on his face that she had not seen before. Something that was undeniably a smile. Not the almost smile or the jaw-releasing slightly that she'd learned to read as his version of warmth, but an actual full smile, the kind that changed the whole geography of a face. She had not known his face could look like that. I'm sorry, he said, and didn't look sorry at all. You should be, she said, and felt something release in her chest that had been held for months. They stood in the barn in the late winter afternoon, and the horses moved in their stalls, and the cold pressed at the boards around them, and neither of them said anything else for a little while because neither of them needed to. Eventually she said, You should tell Hannah. He looked at her. Hannah, your daughter in Fort Collins. She should hear it from you before she hears it from the valley. He was quiet, absorbing this. You're already thinking about what comes next. Aren't you? He considered. Yes, he said. I am. He looked at her with the steady, direct quality she'd come to understand was his version of showing something. That probably should have scared me more than it did. Does it scare you? Yes, he said. Not the way things are supposed to scare you away. More like the way standing at the edge of something real feels. He looked at her. You know what I mean. She did know. She knew exactly what he meant, and the fact that he'd said it in exactly those words, without dressing it up or smoothing it over, was, she thought, the most Ethan Walker thing she'd heard him say. We should go inside, she said. You've been out here without your coat. He looked down at himself as though this had not occurred to him, which she suspected it genuinely hadn't. I have, he acknowledged. There's pie on the counter, she said. I thought you didn't bring pie today. I brought pie. I just didn't lead with it. She turned toward the barn door. I thought if things went a certain way, I might stay for supper. He was quiet for a moment. Then, things went a certain way. Yes, she said. I'd say they did. They walked across the snow-covered yard toward the house, not touching, the cold air around them and the mountains somewhere behind the white sky. And the ground between them that had been a question for months was not anymore a question. It was something else now. Harder probably than the question had been. More exposed. But solid in the way that only things you'd actually decided were solid. Not the stability of avoiding a choice, but the different, more demanding stability of having made one. The kitchen was warm. She cut the pie while he put the kettle on, and the ordinary shape of it was not ordinary at all, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so because they didn't need to. The news moved through Millhaven the way most news moved through Millhaven, not all at once, but in the particular accumulating way of water finding its level, starting with one person who'd seen something and mentioning it to another who'd inferred something, until the original fact had gathered enough interpretation around it to become a story the town felt it owned. What the town owned by the second week of February was this. Abigail Mercer had been seen leaving Ethan Walker's property after dark on a Saturday evening, which had not happened before, and which meant that whatever had been speculated about the Tuesday visits had now graduated into something that required a different quality of attention. Abigail knew this because Ruth Bellamy told her on Monday morning, with the expression of a woman delivering a diagnosis she'd hoped wouldn't be necessary. "I'm not saying it to cause trouble," Ruth said. She was behind the dry goods counter and had stopped measuring the calico she'd been cutting to look at Abigail directly. "I'm saying it because I'd rather you hear it from me than walk into the post office and find out the shape of what's being said in the wrong way." "What shape is it?" Abigail said. "The shape of a young woman who's been turned around by loneliness and made a decision she'll come to regret." Ruth said it without cruelty, with a kind of tired care, the tone of someone who believed what they were saying and thought the saying of it was a service. "I know that's not how you see it, but you asked me." "I did." Abigail looked at the bolts of fabric on the shelf behind Ruth's head and thought about what to say and how to say it. She'd had this conversation, or versions of it, in her own mind for the 2 weeks since the barn, running through the arguments against and finding them wanting, running through the arguments for and finding them solid. She had thought about it more carefully than she'd thought about most things in her life. "Ruth," she said finally, "I appreciate that you mean well. I genuinely do, but what I've decided isn't a thing that happened to me. It's a thing I did on purpose after a long time of thinking." "Well, c'est pas mystique, is it? You're 26. And I'll be 26 whether I'm with Ethan or with Lucas or with nobody at all. My age doesn't go away depending on my choices." Ruth pressed her lips together. "He's a good man, Abigail. I've said that consistently. But good men can still be wrong choices. So can the right-aged ones." She picked up her basket. "I'd like 3 yards of the calico when you're ready." Ruth cut the calico without further comment on the subject, which meant she was deciding to let it sit rather than concede the point. Abigail paid and left and walked out into the February cold with her jaw set at an angle that she recognized. Her father had called it her arithmetic face, the one she got when she was done calculating and had arrived at a number she was prepared to defend. The problem wasn't Ruth. Ruth she could handle. The problem was the accumulating weight of the town's consensus, which had a quality like weather. You could know it was coming and make your preparations and still feel the full force of it when it arrived. Lucas Bennett came to her property on Wednesday. She'd expected him sooner, if she was honest. She'd expected him the Monday after the Saturday she'd stayed for supper at Ethan's because Lucas was efficient with information and she'd assumed someone would bring it to him quickly. But he'd waited 4 days, which told her something about the discipline he was operating with, the careful management of himself that she'd always recognized as one of his genuine qualities. He tied his horse at the post and came to the door without knocking, which he usually did, but this time she heard him stop on the porch for a moment before he opened it, and the pause told her more than the entry would have. She was at the kitchen table with the lease documents, the ones with Mallory's annotations in the margins, and she didn't put them away when he came in. He looked at them on the table, and then at her, and then he sat down without being asked, which was also usual, but the quality of it was different. Less the ease of a man accustomed to welcome, more the deliberate composure of a man who had decided how to conduct himself in a difficult moment and was executing the decision. "I'm going to assume," he said, "that what's being said in town is accurate. That depends on what's being said. That you and Ethan Walker have an understanding." He said it without heat, which she suspected cost him something. "Yes," she said. "That's accurate." He was quiet. He looked at the table. Not the document specifically, just the surface of it, the way people looked at things when they were processing something they'd known was possible and found was still a different experience in actuality than in anticipation. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to be straight with me. I'll do my best. Was there a point when I could have done something differently, said something differently?" He looked up. "Or was this already where it was going, and the year I've put in was just—" He stopped. She thought about how to answer that honestly, because he deserved an honest answer. "I don't think you did anything wrong," she said slowly. "I think you read what you thought was there. And what was there was me. being uncertain about something that wasn't about you, and you being available and reasonable while I was uncertain, and that not being enough. He looked at her steadily. Not enough because of him. Not enough because of what I realized I actually wanted. He's part of that. But it's mine, Lucas. The choice is mine. He nodded, slowly, once, with the precision of a man committing an answer to record. The lease, he said. The terms we agreed to still stand if you want them. I don't conduct business as personal retaliation. My father did. I don't. She looked at him with something that was genuine respect, because that statement had cost him something real, and he'd made it anyway. Thank you, she said. I'd like to keep the arrangement. Then we'll keep it. He pushed his chair back and stood. For what it's worth, he said, picking up his hat from the table. I think you know your own mind. I didn't always act like I believed that, and that's probably the thing I did wrong. She looked at him. That's the most useful thing you could have said. He almost smiled, not quite. Goodbye, Abigail. Goodbye, Lucas. He rode out, and she sat at the table for a moment listening to the sound of his horse on the frozen road and feeling the mixture of things that sat in her chest, relief and something that wasn't quite guilt but was in the same neighborhood, the discomfort of having caused a decent man a genuine disappointment. She didn't try to think it away. She sat with it for a few minutes, the way she sat with other things that were real, and then she picked up Mallory's annotated lease and went back to work. Ethan told Hannah in a letter. He'd written 3 drafts over the course of a week, which was not how he usually wrote letters. His correspondence was generally single draft, functional, the way most of what he produced was functional. But this was a different category of information, and he found that he kept stopping mid-sentence and starting over. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wasn't sure which of the true things to include and which to leave for the conversation he imagined would follow. The letter he finally sent was shorter than all 3 drafts. He told Hannah that he had developed a friendship with his neighbor over the past 2 years that had recently become something more serious, and that her name was Abigail Mercer, and that she was 26, and that he understood this would require some adjustment to process, and that he hoped they could speak about it when she had time. Hannah's reply arrived in 11 days, which was faster than her usual 2-week turnaround, and which he read as informative. He read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, while Abigail was in his south pasture checking on 2 heifers she'd been monitoring since the previous week. She'd taken to arriving early on Tuesdays now, before the pie, to do a walk of whatever section they'd been discussing, which he'd stopped protesting because her eye for animal condition was as good as his and the information was useful. Hannah's letter was 4 pages, which was also informative. She did not object in the way he'd braced for. What she did was more complicated. She wrote with the careful, layered quality of a woman who had thought hard about what she was feeling and was trying to be fair about the parts that weren't flattering. She said she was surprised, which he expected. She said she was uncertain, which he expected. She said she was worried about him, not about his judgment in the particular, but about the position he'd be placed in socially, the difficulty of what a 30-year age gap would mean in a small town. She said she would like to meet Abigail before she had a stronger opinion. And then, in the 4th page, in a paragraph that he read twice, and then sat down and looked at the window for a moment before reading again, she said, Papa, I know what you were like after Mama died. I know what quiet can look like from the inside and from the outside, and I know you would not do something like this carelessly, because you don't do anything carelessly. So I'm not going to tell you what to think. I just want to know you've thought about it properly. He had thought about it properly. He'd thought about almost nothing else for 4 months. He heard the kitchen door and folded the letter when Abigail came in, her coat carrying the cold of the outside and her cheeks reddened from the wind. The younger heifer is fine, she said, pulling her gloves off. The older one has something going on with her left foreleg. Not serious yet, but worth watching. She looked at the folded letter on the table. Hannah? Yes. She didn't ask, which was one of the things about her. She gave information the time to be offered rather than extracting it. She hung up her coat and went to the stove, and he said, She wants to meet you. Abigail's hand stilled on the coffee pot for a moment. Then she resumed. When? She mentioned spring. That's reasonable. She poured the water and came to the table and sat down. How is she taking it? Carefully, he said, which is honest. She's not pretending it isn't a lot to absorb. It is a lot to absorb. Yes. He looked at the letter and then at her. She said, I don't do things carelessly. Abigail looked at him. Something moved across her face. Warm and a little wry, the combination she had that he'd come to think of as entirely hers. She's right, she said. You don't. I'm glad someone's noticed. I've noticed. She tilted her head slightly. Does she sound angry? No. She sounds like someone trying to be fair about feelings that aren't entirely fair. That's the hardest kind. It is. He unfolded the letter and slid it across the table. You can read it if you want. She looked at the letter without touching it. That's private. I'm offering it. She considered him for a moment, the way she did when she was deciding whether something was being given or simply appeared available. Then she picked it up and read it. All 4 pages, slowly, with the focused attention she brought to documents she was trying to actually understand. He watched her read it without trying to read her reading it. When she finished, she set it down carefully, as though returning something. She loves you very much, she said. That's clear in every sentence. I know. Write her back and tell her April. That gives her time to arrange travel, and gives us... She paused. That gives us enough time to be further into this before she sees it. He looked at her. You're already planning. Someone has to. She picked up her cup. You'd leave it open-ended and call it giving her time, when actually you'd just be avoiding the pinning down of a date. He thought about this. That's accurate, he said. I know it is. She said it without superiority, just the flat acknowledgement of someone who had been watching him long enough to understand the patterns. It was one of the qualities of being known, he thought, the slight exposure of it, and the strange relief underneath the exposure. March came in hard, the way March in Colorado often did. 1 week of warmth that made you think winter had conceded, and then a return of cold that was harsher for the deception. The valley road thawed and refroze twice, the cattle were restless, and the joint between the Mercer and Walker properties, that gap in the fence that had long since become a door, was used with a frequency that several people in Millhaven had been informed about and had various responses to. The town's response had stratified, as small-town responses tended to, into layers. At the surface there was the public opinion, which was skeptical and vocal and most frequently expressed by the older residents who had strong feelings about what constituted an appropriate match, and were not shy about those feelings. Margaret Cole had said directly to her Tuesday scripture group, which met at the Grange Hall and whose membership overlapped significantly with everyone else's social circles, that she felt sorrowful for Abigail, who was a capable young woman being pulled in the wrong direction by an emotion she'd mistaken for something more considered. This view circulated efficiently. The Harmon brothers, who were in their early 40s and had the slightly older generation's investment in the existing order of things, had told Ethan at the hardware store that they thought he should consider what he was doing to the girl's prospects, which Ethan had received without visible reaction and which had done nothing to alter his behavior. The report of this exchange went around town in its own version. Underneath the surface, the picture was less uniform. Doc Pearson, who was 70 and had been the Valley's physician for 40 years, and had delivered most of the current generation, including Abigail herself, had said at the barbershop that he'd known Ethan Walker for 2 decades and could not think of a more solid man, and that the town's opinion of what constituted a proper age gap was largely the product of convention and not morality, and that the two were not the same thing. This view circulated less efficiently but was noted. Vera Aldridge, the deputy's wife, which gave her a particular position, had told Ruth Bellamy that she thought Abigail knew her own mind and that Ruth should probably stop inserting herself into the calculation, which had caused a coolness between them that the town was also tracking as a subplot. What all of this meant practically was that Abigail and Ethan moved through the valley under a kind of distributed observation that neither of them had sought and neither of them could avoid, and that the management of it required a quality of steadiness that was different from anything either of them had been tested on before. She handled it differently than he did. She'd learned early in her tenure as a solo ranch operator that the way you carried yourself through public scrutiny was not by challenging it or appeasing it, but by doing your work so well that the scrutiny gradually ran out of material. She was polite to Margaret Cole. She was businesslike with the Harmon brothers when she encountered them. She answered questions about the lease arrangement with Lucas Bennett straightforwardly and without drama, which took that particular topic away from the gossip supply chain. Ethan handled it by saying very little to anyone and conducting himself with the consistency he brought to everything, which was its own kind of statement and which a certain portion of the town found more frustrating than if he'd been defensive about it. In early March, they went together to the hardware store. Not strategically, not as a declaration, but because he needed bolts and she needed wire, and they'd been working the same fence section all morning, and it made sense to go in together. Halverson watched them come through the door with the expression of a man watching a weather event he'd been told to expect. 3 other people were in the store. Nobody said anything that required a response. On the way back down the road, she said, "That went well?" "It went neutrally," he said. "For us, that's well." He considered this. Fair point. In the second week of March, Lucas Bennett signed the finalized lease agreement in Mallory's office, with Abigail present, and with a professional courtesy that she appreciated and acknowledged, and which concluded that chapter of their entanglement in the most decent way available. He shook her hand at the end in a way that was unambiguous about what was finished and what was purely commercial, and she walked out of the office into the pale March sunshine, feeling something settle in her that had been waiting to settle. She went directly to Ethan's from the attorney's office, which was on a Tuesday. He was in the east pasture when she arrived, walking the fence line they'd been planning to repair when the ground softened enough to work. She came through the gap and across the field and fell in beside him without announcement, and he glanced at her and then back at the fence. "Mallory's?" he said. "Signed." She walked in step with him. Lucas was decent about it. He's a decent man. I know. She was quiet for a moment. That doesn't change anything. I know it doesn't. He stopped at a post that was leaning and put both hands on it, testing. Still solid. He moved on. "You all right?" It was a simple question, and she appreciated the simplicity of it. Not probing, not performing concern, just asking the actual thing. "Yes," she said. "I feel better than I did this morning, which means I probably felt worse than I was admitting." "You usually do." She looked at him sideways. "Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation." He stopped again, this time at a post that gave slightly under his hands. He marked it in his memory. "You carry things until you put them down, and you put them down clean when you do. There's no middle. You either have it or you've dealt with it." She thought about this. "Is that a problem?" "Not a problem, just something I've noticed." He kept walking. "You notice things about me. I notice things about you." "Fair," she said, and the word covered more than the surface of it. They walked the rest of the fence line together, marking 3 more posts that needed replacement, and then went back to the barn to note the materials they'd need and figure the cost. She leaned on the barn door while he wrote in the battered ledger he kept on the workbench for exactly this kind of calculation, and she watched his handwriting, the particular way he formed numbers with precision, every digit legible, and thought about the oddness of knowing someone this specifically. Hannah wrote again, he said, without looking up from the ledger. "What did she say?" "She's coming April 15th. She'll stay 4 days." Abigail absorbed this. "Does she want to stay here or at the boarding house in town?" He looked up. "She asked that, actually. I told her I'd ask you." The fact that he'd said I'd ask you, that her opinion was part of the calculation of his daughter's visit, landed with a weight she felt in her sternum. Not heavy. The opposite of heavy. She thought for a moment. "Here," she said. "If she stays in town, she'll spend 4 days getting the town's version of things first. If she stays here, she'll at least see the actual property and the actual—" She stopped. "The actual me," he said. "I was going to say the actual situation." She met his eyes. "But yes. You're going to meet her. Obviously. She's going to have opinions. She can have all the opinions she wants. She's your daughter, and she loves you, and that gives her the right to opinions." Abigail folded her arms across her chest in the way she did when she'd decided something and was done deciding. "I'd rather earn her view than avoid it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Most people don't approach my daughter's scrutiny that way." "I'm not most people." She pushed off the barn door. "I have to get back. I left the yearlings in the east paddock, and I want to check them before dark." He walked with her to the gap the way he always did. The March wind was doing what March wind did, inconsistent, cold one moment, and almost mild the next, carrying that particular quality of a season that hadn't made up its mind. At the gap she turned, which was also now usual, and they stood on the specific ground of that moment in the way that had become their way. "The Harmon brothers are going to say something to you again," she said. "Probably soon. They've been working up to something, I can tell. Let them. I want you to know that if they do, whatever they say doesn't move me. I want you to not manage what you say based on my behalf." He looked at her. "You think I do that? I think you've been gentler in town than you'd otherwise be because you're calculating the effect on me." She held his gaze. "Stop calculating on my behalf. I can manage my own account in this valley." "I know you can," he said. "Then act like it." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said, with a dryness that would have been imperceptible to someone who didn't know him. She pointed at him. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Be dry at me when I'm making a serious point. I can do both at once." She felt the laugh before it arrived and suppressed most of it. "I'm going home," she said. "Good evening," he said, and the warmth in his voice was unguarded in the way it had started being since the barn, like a door he'd opened and decided to leave open. She walked back across the field and up the rise and down the other side, and the wind pulled at her coat, and the mountains to the west were turning that particular rose gold of late March afternoons. And she thought about April 15th and what it would mean to stand in front of Ethan Walker's daughter and be seen and assessed, and found that the prospect frightened her less than it steadied her. That was new. 6 months ago, the idea of being that visible to someone who mattered to him would have made her want to back up and recalibrate. Now it felt like the next solid thing to put her weight on. She got home in time to check the yearlings and found them fine. She made supper and ate it at the table, which she'd started doing again. Not standing at the counter, but properly sitting down, as if the act of stopping for the meal had become something she was willing to allow herself again. She was thinking about fence posts and liniment and a handwriting that formed every number legibly, and she was thinking about a letter 4 pages long from a woman she hadn't met who loved her father enough to try to be fair, and she was thinking about the gap in the fence that had been a gap and was now a door, and the plain fact that the most significant things in her life had a way of arriving without announcement, not as dramatic moments, but as a slow accumulation of ordinary Tuesdays. The Harmon brothers did say something. It was at the end of March, at the feed supply yard, where Ethan had gone to settle his account and pick up the materials for the fence repair. Dale Harmon, the older of the two, with his father's jaw and his own particular way of standing that suggested he was always about to make a point, was already there and caught Ethan before he reached the counter. Ethan. The way Dale said it was the way men said names when they were framing what came next as a private conversation. "You got a minute?" Ethan had a minute. He waited. "My brother and I have been talking," Dale said, which meant the town had been talking and they'd been elected to deliver the summary. "And I want to say this as a man who's known you 20 years, so you understand it's not meant as anything personal." "I understand," Ethan said. He did understand. He'd understood since January what this conversation would be and roughly when it would come. "What you're doing with the Mercer girl is going to end badly," Dale said. "Not because of who you are or who she is individually, but because the math of it." He paused, looking for a language. "She's 26. In 15 years, she's going to be 41, and you're going to be 71. And the life she wants then isn't going to match what you can give her. We've seen it before is the thing. Not exactly this, but close enough." Ethan looked at Dale Harmon. He was a man who knew this valley, who had worked hard land for decades, who was not stupid and was not cruel, and was operating from a kind of concerned pragmatism that Ethan recognized because he'd felt the pull of exactly the same logic for 4 months. "Dale," he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, which is not as an argument." He kept his voice level. "I've had that exact conversation with myself, every version of it. I've told myself the arithmetic 6 ways, and I know the arithmetic by heart." He paused. "And Abigail knows the arithmetic. She knows it better than either of us, because she did the calculating herself without anyone bringing it to her. She's 26, not 16. She arrived at her own conclusion." Dale shifted his weight. "A young woman can believe something sincerely and still be—" "Wrong?" Ethan said. I was going to say misled by what she feels. So can a man of 40, so can a man of 60. Ethan picked up the materials list he'd brought with him and turned it in his hands once. I'm not saying the future isn't complicated. I'm saying the future is complicated for everyone, and the particular shape of the complication doesn't mean the choice is wrong. He met Dale's eyes. I appreciate that you meant this as a kindness. I do. But I'm not changing course based on it. Dale looked at him for a moment. The long, measuring look of a man deciding whether to push further or accept the ground he'd been given. He apparently decided on the latter. All right, he said. I said my piece. You did. Ethan nodded. Tell your brother I said hello. He settled his account and picked up his materials and drove home with the wagon, and the March wind pulled at his coat collar, and he thought about what Dale had said and what he'd said back and found that the saying of it had done something useful, had taken the argument from inside his head, where it had weight, and put it in the open air, where it had the weight of what it actually was, a reasonable concern held by reasonable people, which he had answered as honestly as he could, and which had not changed the fundamental truth of anything. He came through his gate and unhitched the wagon and unloaded the fence materials into the barn, and when he came out she was crossing the field from the gap. It wasn't Tuesday, but she'd seen his wagon from her property and come to help with the unloading, and he had already put everything away, which she registered with the expression of someone who had been outpaced. I saw you coming back, she said. I noticed. He leaned against the barn door. Dale Harmon, he said. She went still. What did he say? What we expected. He told her, without softening or emphasizing the shape of the exchange. She listened with her arms folded, her jaw in its arithmetic setting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you say? He told her that too. She looked at him with the direct, undefended attention she sometimes brought to him, the version of her regard that didn't have a layer of management over it. You said all that, she said. It was accurate. You've been saying the arithmetic was against us since October, and you said all that to Dale Harmon. The arithmetic hasn't changed, he said. My answer to the arithmetic has. She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked at the barn and the fence posts stacked neatly inside it, and the March sky going pale above the mountains, and she said, All right, he agreed. They went inside because the afternoon was getting cold, and she had brought apple pie, and the kitchen was warm, and the town was the town, and would remain the town, and would eventually arrive at whatever conclusion it was going to arrive at. And that conclusion was not, and had never been, the thing that mattered most. What mattered was the table and the 2 cups, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of sitting across from someone who knew the particular shape of your silences, and did not try to fill them, and who noticed the nutmeg, and who said, I noticed things as though that were simply what people did for each other when they were paying the right kind of attention. Outside, the last of the March light went off the mountains, and the valley went blue and cold. And in the kitchen of the Walker Ranch, 2 people sat with their coffee and their pie, and the long winter nearly behind them, and the spring, difficult and uncertain and necessary, beginning, somewhere beneath the frozen ground, to push its way through. Hannah Walker arrived on the afternoon of April 15th on the stage from Fort Collins, with a traveling case that was sensibly packed and an expression that Ethan recognized from her childhood, the one she wore when she was working hard at being fair and finding it effortful. He met her at the stage stop in Millhaven with the wagon, and she climbed down and hugged him with the particular fierceness she'd had since she was small, and he held her for a moment with the uncomplicated relief of a father who had missed his daughter more than he usually admitted to himself. She was 31 now, with her mother's coloring and her own particular way of looking at things, direct, methodical, with a warmth underneath the directness that she didn't always lead with. You look well, she said, stepping back and looking at him with the clinical honesty of someone who had been worrying and was relieved to find the worry partially unfounded. I am well. Your shoulder? Better. She looked at him for another moment, the way she'd been looking at him since she was 16 and had decided she understood him well enough to read the things he didn't say. We'll talk tonight, she said, after I've seen the property. They drove out of town on the road he'd driven 10,000 times, and she looked at the valley the way she always did when she came back, with the simultaneous belonging and distance of someone who had grown up in a place and then built a life somewhere else, so that returning was always a layered experience. She asked about the cattle and the fence work and the creek bank, and he told her, And the conversation had the quality of people who knew each other well enough to use the practical as a bridge to the personal. He told her Abigail would come for supper. He told her straightforwardly, in his second letter, the way he did things when he'd decided to do them. No softening, no build-up, just the information. Hannah had written back that she was glad, and he'd read that glad several times trying to determine its exact temperature, and had concluded it was genuine, if tentative. Abigail arrived at 6, which was what they'd agreed, and she did not bring pie, which Ethan noted and thought was the right instinct. This was not a Tuesday, not the established rhythm of neighborly visits, and arriving with the pie would have made it seem like she was trying to make it comfortable in a way that it wasn't yet comfortable. She knocked at the door, which she almost never did anymore. He opened it, and she came in, and he watched her take in the sight of Hannah standing at the kitchen counter, and he watched Hannah take in the sight of Abigail, and the room did what rooms did when two people who mattered to the same person were in it for the first time. It held its breath. Hannah had his stillness, or a version of it. She didn't rush to fill the moment. She looked at Abigail with the careful, honest attention of a woman running an assessment she was trying to make accurate rather than comfortable. Abigail met it without flinching. She extended her hand. "Hannah, I'm glad you came." Hannah shook it. Her grip was firm, her mother's grip. "I've heard a lot about you," she said, and left the valance of that deliberately open. "I'd imagine," Abigail said, with the flat honesty that was entirely her own. "I've heard a lot about you too. Your father mentions you more than he probably realizes." Something shifted in Hannah's expression. Not a smile exactly, but its precondition. She glanced at her father. "Does he?" "He told me about your letter," Abigail said. "Both of them. He showed me the first one." She paused. "I thought it was one of the most honest pieces of writing I've read. The part about what quiet looks like from the inside and the outside." Hannah looked at her father again, and this time what moved across her face was something more complicated. The particular emotion of hearing your private words reflected back from an unexpected direction and finding that they'd landed where you'd meant them. "Sit down," Hannah said, which was the tone of a woman deciding to actually have the conversation rather than the surface of it. "Both of you. I'll finish the potatoes." Checked. Supper was not easy, but it was honest, which Abigail thought was worth more than easy would have been. Hannah asked direct questions. Not unkind, but not softened either. She asked how long Abigail had been running the ranch alone, and Abigail told her. She asked about the lease arrangement with the Bennetts, and Abigail explained it with the same clarity she'd brought to Mallory's office, including the part where she'd insisted on independent legal review, and something in Hannah's expression acknowledged this as significant without making a production of it. She asked about what had changed between a neighborly arrangement and something more, and Abigail told the truth, that it had been gradual, and then one day in a barn in the snow it had been sudden, and both of those things were true simultaneously. Hannah listened. She ate. She refilled her own coffee and did not refill anyone else's, which Abigail filed away as a data point about the kind of woman she was. Present, not performing hospitality. "My mother died 6 years ago," Hannah said at some point in the middle of the meal, to no one specifically, to both of them. And he just stopped after that. Not in a dramatic way, he kept working. He kept the land. But there was a quality to it that was, she moved her fork. Like a clock running but not keeping time. She looked at Abigail. "I'm not saying that to suggest you're a replacement. I'm saying it because I think you probably need to know what you walked into." "I know what I walked into," Abigail said. "You know some of it. Tell me what I don't know." Hannah looked at her father, who was sitting with his coffee and the particular stillness he used when he was letting a conversation happen around him that needed to happen without his management of it. Then she looked back at Abigail. "He doesn't ask for help," Hannah said, "not even when he needs it badly. He'll damage himself before he'll say he can't manage something alone. You've probably seen that." "The shoulder," Abigail said. Hannah blinked. "What about his shoulder?" "He lifted wrong in February. He was compensating for it for 4 days before I noticed and made him let me work the liniment into it." Hannah looked at her father. "You didn't tell me about the shoulder." "It healed," he said. "That's his answer to everything," Hannah told Abigail. "The thing healed, the problem resolved. Don't worry about it." She shook her head with the exasperation of someone who had been dealing with this for 30 years. "He'll do that with you. He'll carry something until it's critical and then minimize it when you find out." "I know," Abigail said. I've started checking the things he doesn't report. Hannah looked at her steadily. And he lets you? He pretends to resist, and then he lets me. A pause. And then Hannah Walker, who had her father's stillness and her mother's coloring and her own particular way of being in the world, made a sound that was genuinely a laugh. Short, involuntary, the kind that surprised the person making it. She looked at her father. She has your number, she said. She's had my number since September, he said, possibly before. Hannah set her fork down and looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in the way that happened when someone was managing something emotional, with the competence of a person who didn't like to be caught managing it. Okay, she said. Okay. She picked up her coffee cup. I still have questions. I'm going to have questions for the next few days. Ask them, Abigail said. Any of them. I'd rather answer a difficult question than have you leave here with something you didn't get to say. Hannah looked at her for a long moment. My father chose well, she said finally, in the tone of someone rendering a verdict they hadn't been sure they were going to render, and that cost them something to give. Abigail felt the weight of it settle in her chest. She didn't make anything of it. She just said, thank you, and meant it simply, and reached over and picked up the coffee pot and refilled Hannah's cup, and the meal continued. Hannah stayed 4 days as planned, and by the end of the second day, the careful quality of the visit had shifted into something more ordinary. Not the ease of long familiarity, but the functional ease of people who had decided to get on with each other and were doing so. She walked the property with her father on the second morning, the two of them going over the fence work and the creek bank repairs and the condition of the herd, and Abigail stayed away from that walk on purpose, understanding it as the walk it needed to be. On the third day, Hannah came to the Mercer Ranch. She came alone, which Abigail had also expected. She tied her horse at the post and came around to the kitchen door the way people who were comfortable with a place came, and Abigail let her in and put coffee on, and they sat at the kitchen table together without Ethan for the first time. I want to say something, Hannah said when they'd had a few minutes of the ordinary. Without my father here, not because I'm saying something I'd hide from him, he'll know all of it, but because I want to say it to you directly. Go ahead, Abigail said. I came here worried, Hannah said. I want to be honest about that. I came here with the shape of a story in my head about a young woman and my father and a situation that had a kind of vulnerability in it that I was afraid someone was taking advantage of, in one direction or another. She held her coffee cup with both hands the way Abigail did, which Abigail noticed. What I found is different from that story. Different enough that I had to put the story down and look at the actual thing. What's the actual thing? Abigail said. Two people who are genuinely good for each other. Hannah said it plainly, without ceremony. He's been better since October than he's been in 6 years. I couldn't see it in the letters because he doesn't write that kind of thing into letters. But it's in his face and in the way he moves around his property and in the way he talks about the land, like it matters again in the way it used to. She paused. And you're not what I expected. I expected someone who was maybe lost or lonely or running toward something without looking at it clearly. You're none of those things. I was lonely, Abigail said. I won't pretend otherwise. Running a ranch alone is isolating in ways that aren't always visible. Sure, Hannah said. But lonely people make choices that address the loneliness. That's not what this is. This is, you looked at my father and you saw something specific and you decided it was what you wanted. That's different. She set down her cup. I'm not going to pretend the age gap doesn't exist. It exists. There are things about the future of this that are genuinely complicated, and I'd be dishonest to say otherwise. I know they are, but I've stopped believing the complication is a reason to not do it. Hannah looked at her with her father's directness. I want you to know you have my support, for whatever that's worth. Abigail looked at the woman across her kitchen table, this daughter of a man she loved, who had come 400 miles to do the honest and difficult work of actually looking at something before deciding what she thought about it, and felt a warmth that was its own distinct thing, separate from what she felt for Ethan, and connected to it. It's worth a great deal, she said, more than you probably know. Hannah nodded once, in the way her father nodded. Then she picked up her coffee and looked around the kitchen. Your fence along the south pasture, she said. The section by the road. What about it? 3 posts leaning. Abigail blinked. I know, I've been getting to it. Dad's going to offer to help and you're going to tell him you can manage it yourself. Probably. Let him help, Hannah said. He needs to be needed, not depended on. There's a difference, but needed. She looked at Abigail with the clear eyes of someone who had spent 30 years understanding a person. He spent 6 years on that property, doing everything alone because there was no one to do anything with. Let him help with the fence. Abigail thought about this. It was a different kind of instruction than she usually received about Ethan, and it came from a different kind of knowing than she had yet, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize the value of what she was being given. All right, she said. I'll let him help with the fence. Hannah's mouth moved. Good. She stood and put on her coat. He's going to be insufferable about it, she said. He'll do it efficiently and say nothing and feel very satisfied with himself. I know, Abigail said. I've seen the satisfied with himself face. Hannah laughed. The same short, involuntary laugh from the first night. God help you, she said, and caught herself. Sorry. Force of habit. Don't apologize, Abigail said. It's a reasonable sentiment. Hannah left, and Abigail stood at the kitchen door watching her ride back down the road. And the April afternoon was warm in the way April afternoons sometimes were in Colorado. Genuinely warm. Not the false warmth of early March, but the real thing, the kind that meant the ground was ready and the season had committed. She went out to look at the south fence posts. 3 leaning. Hannah was right. She went back inside and put on her coat and crossed the field to get Ethan. They married in September. Not a large ceremony. Neither of them wanted large, and the decision was made with the same practical honesty they brought to most decisions, which was that they would do what fit them rather than what was expected, and what fit them was an afternoon in the courthouse in Harlan with Hannah and her husband James as witnesses, and Mallory, the attorney, to handle the paperwork, and Doc Pearson, who had driven out on his own initiative because he said he'd been in this valley long enough to witness the things that actually mattered. Ruth Bellamy heard about it the following day and came to the Mercer Ranch, which was where Abigail still was, for now, the practical question of what to do with 2 separate ranch operations being one they were working through carefully, and stood at the door with an expression that had moved past its previous certainty into something more complicated. I heard, Ruth said. I know you did. Abigail opened the door wider. Come in. Ruth came in and sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee that was offered and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone reassembling themselves around information that had rearranged things. I want to say that I was worried about you, she said finally. Not that I was right about what I said, just that the worry was real. I know it was, Abigail said. I never thought otherwise. And I want to say, Ruth stopped, started again. He looked at you at the post office last week, when you didn't see him looking, and I thought, that's not a man who's taken advantage of anything. She wrapped her hands around her cup. That's a man who knows exactly what he has. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. He does. Ruth nodded slowly with the particular quality of a person closing an argument they'd been making to themselves. Well, she said, congratulations then. Belated. Thank you, Ruth. The pie you bring him. Apple? Always. Ruth's mouth curved slightly. He trained you, she said, with a dryness that was almost warmth. He really did, Abigail agreed. Ruth left after her coffee, and Abigail stood at the window watching her go and felt the quiet satisfaction of a thing that had been resistant beginning to loosen. Not everything. The valley's judgment didn't reverse itself overnight, and she'd never expected it to. Margaret Cole still had her opinions, and the Harmon brothers were still the Harmon brothers. And there would be people in Millhaven who would hold their position indefinitely, because that was what some people did. But the general character of the town's attention had shifted from the sharp, active interest of scandal to something more like the background hum of ongoing assessment, which was manageable, and which she'd learned to live with, and which she suspected would, over years, resolve into nothing more remarkable than, that's Abigail and Ethan Walker, they have the property east of the Creek Road. That would be enough. The question of what to do with 2 ranches took most of the autumn to work out, and the working out of it was not always smooth. The first serious argument they had as a married couple was about the Mercer cattle. She wanted to integrate both herds into a single operation using the best grazing rotation across both properties. Sensible, efficient, what any rancher would have concluded looking at the combined acreage. He thought they should keep the herd separate for the first year to understand how the pasture capacities interacted before committing to a single rotation. She thought this was overcautious and said so. He thought her plan moved too fast and said so. The conversation at the kitchen table lasted 2 hours and involved the ledger and 3 different maps of the combined property, and 2 separate instances where one of them said something the other found more pointed than intended, and the particular quality of a real disagreement between 2 people who were both accustomed to making decisions alone and had not yet fully developed the grammar of making them together. They arrived eventually at a compromise that was neither of their original positions, a partial integration of the herds with a monitoring period, which was both more conservative than her plan and more flexible than his. She thought it was probably the right answer. She suspected he thought so too, and was not yet ready to say so directly, which was something she was learning about him. That he arrived at concessions genuinely but announced them reluctantly, as though the announcing were its own separate capitulation. "You could just say I was partially right," she said, after the compromise had been reached and they'd moved on to the practical details. "You were partially right," he said. "You said that like it hurt." It was moderately uncomfortable. He was writing in the ledger, the handwriting she'd catalogued without meaning to. "You were also partially wrong." "I know I was. I already said that." "You said the modified plan was reasonable. That's not the same as acknowledging you were partially wrong." She looked at him across the table. Are you actually holding me to the same standard you applied to yourself?" "Yes." "I was partially wrong," she said. "Thank you." He kept writing. She stared at him for a moment. Then, despite herself, she picked up her coffee and drank it, and said nothing else, because she had the sense, the new, unfamiliar, faintly disconcerting sense, of having met her match in a way she hadn't fully anticipated, which was a different thing than she'd expected, and better than what she'd expected, and that required some private adjusting. She adjusted. The following spring, the combined Walker operation turned a better return than either property had done separately in the previous 3 years. This was not magic, and it was not luck. It was the product of her financial instincts applied to a larger operation, and his decades of understanding applied to the same, and the specific multiplication that happened when 2 people's different competencies addressed the same problem from different angles. She found the inefficiencies in the supply arrangements he'd been accepting out of habit. He identified the pasture rotation she was proposing that would have overgrazed the north section in a dry year. She renegotiated the hay contract in January and saved them enough to replace the entire east fence line. He spent February rebuilding the smaller outbuilding she'd told him for 2 years was inefficiently laid out, and the new version was better. And he didn't tell her she'd been right, but he also didn't need to. Hannah came again in June with her husband James and their 2 children, a 4-year-old girl named Clara and an 18-month-old boy who had recently discovered walking and was devoted to the project. Ethan was not a man who performed emotions publicly, but she watched him with those grandchildren in the yard of what had been his empty property, and she understood something about what the years alone had actually cost him. Not in the way of self-pity, but in the plain, inventory sense of what had been absent and was now present. The 4-year-old Clara decided on the first afternoon that Abigail was interesting and followed her around the property with a running commentary on everything she observed, which Abigail navigated with the same straight-faced patience she brought to livestock that required individual handling. At some point, Clara asked whether Abigail was her grandfather's wife, and Abigail confirmed this, and Clara said, "But you're not old," with the frank bewilderment of a child encountering a fact that didn't fit the category she'd been using. And Abigail said, "Your grandfather isn't as old as he sometimes acts," which made James Walker laugh from 20 feet away where he'd been pretending not to listen. Hannah found Abigail at the creek bank late on the second afternoon, checking the willow stakes they'd driven in a year and a half ago. The stakes had taken hold, green-leafed now, pulling at the bank edge, doing exactly what willow stakes were supposed to do. "They worked," Hannah said, looking at the growth. "They did." Abigail tested one with her hand and found it firm. "We'll need to extend the line another 20 feet in autumn. The bank is still soft where the cattle have been coming down." "You sound like him," Hannah said. Abigail looked at her. "The way you talk about the property." Hannah sat down on the bank edge with the ease of someone who'd decided to be there for a while. "It's the same. Not the words. The words are different. The way you carry it, like you're responsible for it, like it's actually yours. It is mine, Abigail said. Both of them are mine now. I know. Hannah looked at the creek. I meant it as a compliment. He used to talk about this land like it was the only thing that made sense. After Mama died, I mean. Like everything else was negotiable, but the land was real. She paused. You talk about it the same way, and I think maybe that's part of what he saw in you. Not just you, but you and the land together, the way you take it seriously. Abigail sat down beside her on the bank. The creek ran low and clear in the June afternoon, and the cottonwoods were full-leafed now, and somewhere up the slope one of the children was shouting something at Ethan with the particular urgency of small children who had just discovered something they needed an adult to witness immediately. I want to ask you something, Abigail said. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. Ask. Did you mean it? Last April when you said he chose well. Did you mean it, or were you being generous? Hannah was quiet for a moment. A real pause, not a deflecting one. I meant it, she said. I wasn't at April 9th. By April 12th, I did. She looked at Abigail. You want to know what moved it? If you'll tell me. The fence posts, Hannah said. The 3 leaning ones on your south line. I mentioned them and you already knew about them and had a plan for them. And I thought, she's been watching this land the way someone watches land they love. Not land they're managing, land they love. She shrugged in the way of someone who has reduced a complex thing to its actual essence. That's a person my father can build something with. Abigail looked at the creek for a moment. Then she said, Thank you for coming last April, for asking the hard questions. You answered them well. I was terrified. Hannah looked at her with something that was unmistakably the beginning of the kind of regard that grew between women who had decided each other was worth the growing. I know, she said. You didn't look it. That's the same thing he does. She shook her head. What a pair. What Abigail understood, by the time the second winter on the combined Walker property had come and gone, was something she could not have told you at 24 or even at 26 when she'd started carrying apple pie across the field every Tuesday. Something that required the particular angle of experience you only got from the inside of a thing, not the outside of it. She understood that the town had not been wrong about the complications. They had been wrong about whether the complications were reasons. That was the distinction, and it was a real one. And she'd found it not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days. The arguments about cattle rotations, the shoulder that needed liniment, the fence post that needed replacing, the ledger that needed balancing, the silences that needed nothing at all. She understood that love was not the absence of difficulty. She'd known that intellectually for years, the way you knew things you hadn't yet been tested on. She knew it differently now, in the body of it, in the actual grain of a life that was built beside someone, where the building was real and imperfect, and sometimes frustrating, and always, underneath the frustration, something she would not have exchanged for any smoother arrangement. She understood that what the town had called a 30-year age gap was also 30 years of Ethan Walker being exactly the kind of person he was, 30 years of the particular qualities she'd been watching since September of the year she realized she'd been watching, and that you did not get those qualities without those years, and that the arithmetic, whatever way you ran it, kept arriving at the same answer. She understood that the people who had doubted her had mostly been trying to protect her, and that the trying to protect was real even when the doubt was wrong, and that holding both of those things simultaneously was what grown people did with the people who loved them imperfectly. One evening in October, the 2nd October, 2 years almost exactly from that morning on the porch, when she'd made a joke about age and the air between them had shifted, she came in from checking the north fence and found Ethan at the kitchen table with the ledger and the lamp burning low and the remains of the supper he'd made because she'd been out late and he'd known she would be. She sat down and pulled off her boots and ate the supper cold because she was hungry, and because cold supper from someone who'd made it and kept it was something she had the sense now to appreciate. North line is holding, she said. The new posts are solid. Good. There's a section by the creek bend I want to monitor through the winter. The ground's softer there than it should be. I'll look at it tomorrow. You don't need to. He looked at her over the ledger. She stopped. All right, she said. Look at it tomorrow. He looked back at the ledger. She ate her supper. After a while, he said, Hannah wrote. She's thinking about April again. Tell her April's good. Tell her to bring the children. Claire will follow you around the property for 4 days straight. I know. I'm already planning what to show her. She set down her fork. There's a fox den near the South Creek Bend. The kits were out last week. She'd want to see that. He lowered the ledger and looked at her with the expression she'd cataloged without intending to, the one that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite its absence, the one she'd come to understand was the fullest version of what he had to show, when what he had to show was something he couldn't put plainly into words. She looked back at him across the kitchen table. The table she'd sat at for 2 years of Tuesdays before it became hers too, the lamp between them, the Colorado October pressing at the windows. And she thought about a gap in a fence that had become a door, and about a blueberry pie that had taught her to pay attention, and about the specific weight of a hand against her face in a barn full of horses in winter light. She thought about what it meant to choose something fully, with both eyes open to the difficulty and the complication and the 30-year arithmetic that people kept running for you unbidden, and to find on the other side of the choosing not the resolution of difficulty, but the discovery that you were capable of more than you'd known, and that capability had been there all along, waiting for the right thing to require it of you. There are people who spend their whole lives waiting for a version of the future that looks right from the outside, that fits the expected shape, that earns the easy approval of the people watching. And there are people who learn, at some point, early or late, or in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, that the outside view was never the one that mattered, that what matters is the view from inside your own life, from inside your own choosing, and whether the thing you've chosen is real. Abigail Mercer Walker had the view from inside, and it was imperfect and demanding and occasionally maddening, and it was real in a way she would not have traded for anything smoother or simpler or more easily explained. Fox kits, Ethan said. Fox kits, she confirmed. He nodded and went back to the ledger, and she picked up her fork, and the lamp burned steady between them. And outside the October mountains were dark against a sky full of stars. And the land, both pieces of it, the Mercer and the Walker, now just theirs, lay quiet under the first real cold of the season, waiting for whatever the next year would ask of it. It would ask a great deal. It always did. They would be ready. They always were.